What does Israel have to do with local policing in the United States?
Well, Israelis are actually training local police and private security forces all over the world. That's really one of their big businesses. But what's so fascinating to me about this story is that it's been on my radar at least for a decade, if not more. It's something that's not a secret by any means. I mean, these trips are advertised on the websites of the groups that sponsor them, and yet it is never talked about. It's really fascinating to me that even now that we have so much attention on police departments in the US, on the militarization of police, the fact that these officers, and we're talking about hundreds of them, are going to Israel yearly to train with military forces there is just not talked about. And I think that's quite fascinating.
I mean, I first encountered Israeli private security in 2005 when I was in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. There was a firm called Instinctive Shooting International, ISI, that was hired to guard a wealthy white enclave in New Orleans. And when I was researching at the time, I was sort of stunned to see how deeply embedded Israeli firms are in every level of the U.S. Homeland Security apparatus in terms of training, and also the national security apparatus. That, to me, I think is one of the most disturbing aspects of this, that Israel is viewed in the world as one of the most efficient assassins that exists on the international scene. And now they're increasingly working with American police forces armed with what are clearly weapons of war, not policing.
Right. You think American cops don't need any further militarizing, but I guess you can always get better at killing, I suppose. But no, I actually met Israeli security forces in Haiti in the aftermath of the earthquake there in 2010. So they're everywhere. This is like a huge business for Israel. It makes sense, right? When your entire country has gone through the military and everybody has military experience, that's, a great thing to have in your resume if you're going to look to make money. That's something you can market. And what's really interesting is they've been able to market their experience in the occupied territories, and their occupation of Palestine has become this selling point, really, that's put on brochures that sort of highlight Israel's strength as a counterterrorism force. But when they train American cops on counterterrorism, a majority of what they're teaching them ends up being used against civilians in the U.S. I mean, most police departments in the U.S. do not face serious terrorism threats.
This is an incredible part of your story. I just want to share this with our listeners. You write, in the aftermath of 9/11, Israel seized on its decades-long experience as an occupying force to brand itself a world leader in counterterrorism. U.S. law enforcement agencies took the Jewish state up on its expertise by participating in exchange programs sponsored by an array of pro-Israel groups like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and the Anti-Defamation League. What on earth are those lobbying entities doing, arranging counterterrorism, so-called counterterrorism training for U.S. police forces?
I mean, and I think perhaps the most ironic of them is the Anti-Defamation League, which really presents itself as a civil rights organization that here in the U.S. counters supposedly abusive policing. And they, in the aftermath of Ferguson, have been very strongly opposed to people that draw comparisons between the occupation of Palestine and the militarization of police in the U.S. A lot of people in Ferguson were sort of comparing themselves to Gaza, which is questionable in many ways, obviously. But there is definitely a solidarity that's being built between occupied people in different ways.
Right. And you talked about in recent days, there was this delegation of top U.S. law enforcement officers in Israel for a seminar that was sponsored by the Anti-Defamation League. It was a national counterterrorism seminar. Topics such as leadership in a time of terror, balancing the fight against crime and terrorism. More than 200 law enforcement executives from over 100 departments in the U.S. participated in this?
Have been participating in this since 2004 when it first launched. This week, there were several top U.S. officials. Sometimes immigration enforcement agents also participate. Sometimes campus police participate in these trainings. They go to Israel and they learn from Israeli police as well as the IDF, so the Defense Forces military, as well as security forces that really work on border patrol. And I think the most important thing to remember here is that these are U.S. cops that are tasked with enforcing civil law and criminal law here in the U.S., but they're learning from people that are enforcing military rule over occupied people. So the parallel is really quite interesting. I mean, Israeli security forces operate in a non-democratic context, and these are U.S. public servants that are learning those tactics, presumably to bring back and use against U.S. citizens.
You specifically talk in your article about the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Commander Morgan Kane, who attended the training. What did the D.C. police say to you when you reached out to them?
Right. So, well, first of all, we only know about Morgan Kane, who's a female commander actually in DC. And we only know about this because Jewish Voice for Peace, which is one of the organizations that's been exposing the strips, was able to find her name in a document they FOIA'd. And so I reached out to the police department in DC, and basically they, as many others, really framed the strip as a counterterrorism opportunity. An opportunity for DC police to learn, techniques that will keep DC residents and tourists safe. That's really what they present. Never mind that DC also has major problems, as many other cities do, with policing its own poor Black, brown citizens. It has a history of, abuses. There have been a number of police killings there, as there have been in other cities. And so it's really difficult to kind of draw a line and say, I'm learning about counterterrorism and I'll come back and not use it against everybody else and still police in a constitutional manner. I mean, these things really are connected. You can't separate one from the other. There's kind of this idea that counterterrorism is okay, but non-constitutional policing isn't. And even on the counterterrorism front, I mean, there's plenty, obviously, of abuse that comes out of these strips. For instance, the NYPD infamous Muslim spying program a few years back, that was pretty much modeled on the surveillance of Palestinians in the West Bank. And one of the officers, one of the top commanders actually in the NYPD that was behind it, had participated in one of these trainings in Israel. So you really see these techniques and how these methods are brought back home and put in place against US citizens, in this case, Muslim citizens. But one other thing I would point out is that the exchange also goes both ways. I mean, you'd think Israelis don't have anything to learn from Americans in terms of oppressing populations, but they do. And one thing that, for instance, happened last year in Israel is that the government passed basically the equivalent of our stop and frisk law, which, of course, has been very much contested in a number of US cities. Meanwhile, in Israel, this new law is essentially doing the same thing. And of course, because the law itself is so vague, where basically any officers can stop anyone they suspect of being up to something, essentially, that's been applied very discriminatorily, and it's, with racism towards Palestinians.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of cohesion between how the U.S. Conducts itself in the world and how Israel conducts itself in Palestine, and increasingly we're seeing those two merge in the U.S. But I wanted to get your analysis on, once again, the violence that we saw of the police in St. Louis in recent days.
I mean, I always feel like St. Louis is just a little bit ahead of the rest of the country in terms of finding out the flashpoints and really sort of showing you in a nutshell what policing and the relationship between police and Black and brown communities in this country is. As you know, I was in Ferguson 3 years ago. I'm kind of beginning to see the same thing happening again. I don't know if you saw from people that were on the scene, there was a moment when, after making a number of arrests, police reportedly started chanting,
"Whose streets are streets?
Our streets." Which is, of course, the protester anthem by default. And the fact that police would have really the arrogance and the nerve to chant this in the streets that they are supposed to serve is just astounding to me. So really, St. Louis, I think, captures this kind of conflict. St. Louis has in the past been an indicator of how these conflicts will play out. So we'll be watching for sure.